and marketing specialist with experience spanning diplomacy, development finance, and consulting. And he supports engagements with financial institutions to address climate risk-related challenges and opportunities, and has worked on issues related to climate resilience finance since 2016. Andrew has been involved with Gary since about 2018. He's a longtime friend of Gary, and we've known each other and worked together for many years. Andrew worked with us in 2022 to launch this virtual speaker series, and as noted before, this is our 7th event, and so we are delighted. Andrew's done a fantastic job pulling together panelists and coming up with great topics and also moderating the discussion. So I'm very excited to hand it over to Andrew once again. So Andrew, hand it to you.
Thanks so much, Lori, for that lovely introduction. Great to be back with Gary today. And I was trying to figure out if this actually was our 7th or if we had lost count. I think maybe if you count Arise, the one we did a month or 2 back, I think we're actually at 8. So we need to, work on our arithmetic. But we'll get that right next time, I'm sure. That was on me. So thank you so much for that. And appreciate our panelists and our audience joining today for a very exciting and timely topic, sustainable cooling as a climate solution, investing in resilience to extreme heat. This is a topic I think that anyone who's lived on this planet over the last several months can appreciate firsthand. Global cooling is an issue that reflects a human need for space cooling, for comfort, for health, as well as for supply chains, protection of food supplies, and so forth, medical supplies as well. It touches our lives in many ways that I think those who may not have thought much about this space before would be surprised to realize. So we're going to delve into the topic and start with an overview, and then quickly turn it over to our esteemed panel of experts here who know this space inside and out. So a few words of introduction before I hand it over to our keynote. The global cooling space has human needs that are enormous and growing. Over 1 billion people today still lack access to life-saving cooling, such as air conditioning and refrigeration, and rising temperatures are making this challenge more difficult. Temperature records are being set with increasing frequency, even in northern latitudes like Canada and the UK, leading to increasing cooling needs. Heat extremes present an increasing source of illness and mortality, which we've observed tragically in many heat waves around the world in the summer of 2023. Cooling is critical for multiple development goals, including food security, healthcare, quality education, gender equity, affordable and clean energy, sustainable cities, fostering innovation, and climate change. The need is finally being recognized. The next climate negotiations in Dubai, COP28, later this fall, has been formally labeled the Cooling COP, and the UN Environment Program led Cool Coalition is preparing a Cooling Global Stocktake, about which we'll hear more in a moment. And yet this issue still does not seem to have entered mainstream policy or investment discourse to the degree necessary, even in many climate policy, clean energy, and professional development forums. Today, we'll look at this vital topic from the Gary perspective, investing in climate resilience. To unpack the challenges and opportunities, the suite of technologies and business models emerging in the cooling space, and the investment demands and possibilities, we have a terrific slate of speakers and panelists. We're joined today by our keynote speaker, Alan Miller, who's the co-founder of Systemic Cooling Partners, as well as a contributing author to the forthcoming UN Cool Coalition Global Stocktake, as well as 3 expert panelists: Helen Walter Taranoni, Sustainable Director of Train; Selçuk Tanatar, Head of Advisory Services at IFC's Disruptive Technologies and Funds Department; and Jonathan Nyman, Managing Partner of Systemic Cooling Partners. Our format today will be our initial keynote, followed by introductory remarks from each of our panelists to give an overview of the topic, after which we'll have about 15 minutes for moderation, questions, and discussion, followed by a Q&A toward the end of the session. So a couple of housekeeping notes. We record these events. We'll make this recording available afterwards. And we also have a chat feature such that audience members can pose questions to the speakers as we go. You can drop those into the chat. And we'll try to address them in the Q&A portion of our discussion today. So without any further ado, let me introduce our keynote speaker, Alan Miller. Alan's career spans more than 4 decades working on ozone protection and climate change. He retired from the International Finance Corporation, or IFC, in 2014, where he supervised climate finance projects and represented the World Bank at the UN climate negotiations. His focus has been on sustainable cooling since 2017, helping produce reports for Sustainable Energy for All, the World Bank, and the forthcoming UNEP Global Stocktake. This year, he joined our speaker, Jonathan Nyman, to form Sustana, first venture fund with a focus on sustainable cooling. And Alan was also my first supervisor after graduate school at the IFC, so I am deeply indebted to Alan in many ways, and also am in awe of his many accomplishments in areas of expertise. So Alan, we're delighted to have you today, and thank you for joining. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew, and I would say it's also been a great honor just to have played a small role in your burgeoning career and to have shared in some concerns over cooling over the years. It's a great honor also to be joined by such a distinguished panel, and accordingly, I will make my remarks fairly brief, recognizing that we have 3 extraordinary speakers in terms of long-standing expertise on refrigerants and innovative cooling technology and cooling-related finance. As Andrew said, we all know how hot it has been this summer and have been waking up, as I know, even just in the Washington, D.C. area, to heat advisories telling me, stay in an air-conditioned room. And this admonition has only set the stage in some ways for what we have to talk about, which is that with the extraordinary steady increase in heat, North America having achieved a heat record over the past summer, now it's estimated not simply from the highest temperatures, but from heat in general, that up to 20,000 deaths a year in North America may be linked to hot temperatures. And as we'll talk about further, we're very fortunate in the degree to which we have air conditioning compared with many developing countries. With rising heat and income, especially in South Asia, the growth in the air conditioning market has been extraordinary, with an air conditioner sold every 10 seconds. But the complexity of the market for cooling is often not widely understood. And as Andrew mentioned, cooling is relevant across quite a wide range of needs and sectors. We think of it primarily for buildings where construction and design and passive solutions can be equally or more effective from both an economic and comfort standpoint than the addition of an air conditioner. We also know that with data centers and other industrial practices dependent on cooling, that demand is steadily growing. But less often is the recognition of the importance of cold chain for food and health services, for both of which it's an extraordinarily important consideration. It's estimated over 1/3 of food grown in the world is lost, much higher in many developing countries, because of the absence of cold chain to transport food from rural areas to markets. And you'll maybe hear a little bit from my colleague Salchuk Tanatar about some of the interesting efforts to find solutions. There's also, less frequently noted, the large share of existing equipment that is inefficient, expensive to operate, and may leak greenhouse gases. With the Kigali Amendment, which our speaker, Helen Walter-Tirinoni, has been working on for many years, there is an effort to replace globally the very widely used hydrofluorocarbons, which are extremely potent greenhouse gases on the order of 1,200 times carbon dioxide, but with shorter atmospheric lifetimes. We've also in recent weeks seen references to how the absence of functioning cooling equipment required the closure of many schools. And this is something that's been very disruptive to educational practices. More generally, to talk briefly again about the role of cooling in human development, Andrew very rapidly listed off many of the SDGs for which cooling is essential. I'm hearing a bit of an echo. Is that me from my end or yours? Okay, I think that's better. But I did just want to briefly revisit the importance of cooling for so many of the development goals. That there is this billion or so people, as Andrew again mentioned, without access to cooling because partly, first and foremost, they lack access to power. And part of the way I came into the subject of cooling was through Sustainable Energy for All, a UN body that focuses on attempting to make energy access more widely available. And as they do, through both extensions of the grid but distributed power, one of the first things that people will often buy is initially a fan and then subsequently a small air conditioner when and if they can afford it. But there are, to emphasize the point, a substantially greater number of people who lack reliable access to cooling. So they may have fans and even an air conditioner and a refrigerator, but if the power is not reliable, which is true in many parts of the world, it's been estimated that probably on the order of a couple billion people more lack access to reliable cooling. So why isn't more emphasis being put onto this subject? Well, there are several reasons that we'll talk about in more detail. The first that we recognize from the work that I've done previously is that cooling is often a secondary consideration in investment decisions. It's very rarely the first, largest, and most important issue in the minds of investors, particularly, for example, in the design and location of a building, but equally so in many other aspects of health systems, where, for example, cooling is critical for the distribution of vaccines, but it's not a consideration that typically is first and foremost in the minds of health agencies, although that has been evolving more recently with COVID. There's also a significant impact that we'll talk about briefly on the operation and reliability of power systems. So what we've been seeing in recent years with the increased demand for cooling has been a tremendous burden on peak demand, which in some countries, particularly in the Middle East, can easily achieve 50% or more. And it's not only in terms of demand, it's also an impact on supply, because power plants operate less efficiently in extreme heat, as do solar panels. And the consequence is that just when the power system is least efficient and reliable, often is when cooling demand is greatest. We saw this recently as Jonathan Nabhan has experienced in California, where there was a plan to close several gas plants as part of a greenhouse gas strategy. And this was reversed because of the need to keep the power system reliable. So there are a number of ways that this is attempting to be addressed. We just heard, as Andrew noted, the UNEP Global Stocktake Cooling Day at the COP this year. Helen, and her role on the Montreal Protocol TEEP, has been working very actively on efforts to more closely integrate replacement of refrigerants with energy efficiency. All of these are somewhat beginning steps in the right direction. I also worked on the one and only Green Climate Fund large cooling facility project approved in October 2021 to support 9 developing countries with cooling components in, again, larger building, health, and educational projects. And there are NGOs becoming more active in the field as well. Just to recognize 2, RMI, formerly to many of us, the Rocky Mountain Institute, played a leading role in the development of a global cooling prize to achieve a 5-fold reduction in the global warming impact of cooling. Prizes were awarded to Daikin and Godrej, but have still yet to reach market. And of course, the Arstrock Resilience Center started with significant philanthropic contributions at the Atlantic Council, and which has been doing significant work promoting cooling action at the city level, and also promoting a concept for naming heat waves, which addresses yet another of the challenges to extreme heat, which is we don't have any simple and equivalent metric to the way we do for hurricanes. And it's a very complicated subject. I don't know, Andrew will get into it here about the complexities in communicating extreme heat, but it is a very important subject. So I'll just close with a brief reference to what I know my colleagues will talk about in greater detail, but there so far continues to be relatively low level of investment in cooling, in contrast with many other forms of climate-related technology. So any of us who are climate activists or who follow the Inflation Reduction Act are very aware of the massive many billions going into things like direct air capture and green hydrogen, which are frankly many years away from large-scale commercial introduction. There is nothing so far equivalent for innovative cooling. And this is why I joined with Jonathan, as he'll speak about more in a few minutes, and to give credit to Selçuk Tanatar, who with UK funding has been among the few dedicated programs in the world for actively identifying and supporting early stage cooling technology. So just to close, sustainable cooling solutions are urgently needed if the planet is to avoid catastrophic warming and to make progress on human development. The IEA is one source of regular updates. The global stocktake from UNEP this year, rather optimistically, is proposing what can be done to achieve net zero by 2050. My hope is, with the support of those you're going to hear from on this panel, that truly may turn out to be possible. Andrew, back to you.
Thank you so much, Alan, for that really helpful overview. And I did rattle through some of the points very quickly at the top, so I'm glad you've unpacked them for the audience. And it really is important to ground the conversation, because the magnitude of this challenge is important. Its importance from both a mitigation and adaptation standpoint, in terms of grid stability, in terms of human well-being, is hard to overstate. And so it really is long past due. And I wanted to also credit you for being an early advocate in the space, and also for proposing this webinar. So thank you so much for presenting that background on this issue and helping kick off this exciting discussion. So let me now turn to our panelists. I'd like to first introduce Helen Walter-Taranoni. Helen leads climate policy for Trane Technologies. She holds a master's degree in engineering with a concentration in environmental engineering at Syracuse University. And she has led transitions in technology, manufacturing, and business, including low global warming potential refrigerant development, supply chain, environmental mitigation, hazardous process safety, and strategic planning. She is also currently a co-chair of the UN Montreal Protocol FOAM's Technical Options Committee and a member of the Technical Economic Assessment Panel, or TEAP, of the Montreal Protocol. So, Helen, you are among the global foremost experts in this space on cooling and refrigerants, and so I'm delighted to hand you the floor to tell us a bit about your experience and your perspectives on this issue.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you to you and Alan for inviting me to participate in this panel. I've had the good fortune to work for Trane Technologies now. So Trane Technologies manufactures cooling equipment, not only for buildings, so chillers and such, but also for the entire cold chain. So we're talking about kind of farm to, to the retailer, as well as for vaccines and the very cold temperatures for vaccines, as well as for even pharmaceutical work and development. So I think I bring a couple of different perspectives maybe to this conversation that I wanted to kind of talk through a little bit here. So Alan and Andrew both talked a little bit about the Montreal Protocol and the intersection of refrigerants and energy efficiency. And I think, interestingly, the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol for substances that deplete the ozone layer, so that's the HFC phase down of supply, did include a clause that energy efficiency must be maintained or reduced in these transitions. And we were talking before the call a little bit about the fact that I think that language, the parties have been working to kind of think through what that means and how they implement that. And so I think this is a really exciting time for those discussions. And I'm very eager to kind of see how those come out in the coming months as they kind of move to implementation around maintaining or improving energy efficiency in the refrigerant transition. So as was noted earlier as well, the UAE presidency of the COP has declared that this is the cooling COP. And there's this special emphasis on sustainable cooling, and I would add heating as well. If we think about heat pumps and the heat transfer fluids that are used for heat pumps. And I think there's the supporting system there within the Montreal Protocol and the Kigali Amendment. But I would say the UAE presidency has also been working on a cooling pledge, which I think is an exciting opportunity for parties as well as non-parties and industry to kind of show their support, not only from a policy perspective, but also in actions and in credible reporting around those actions and commitments. And I think that it's quite in line with the Climate Ambition Summit from the Secretary General of the UN, where he is looking where that lead has been taken around ambition, credibility, and implementation. So I think all of this is kind of linking up together at the perfect time because there's so many challenges to overcome. And I think that as we lay the groundwork to overcome challenges around, especially for countries that are receiving technologies. So if we think about especially small countries that have no manufacturing base in their country, and we kind of think through the fact that they're receiving equipment during this transition, and sometimes it's difficult to control that at the border and ensure that there's sufficient energy efficiency requirements. I think this is especially important as we think through how do we support policies, how do countries that are small create policies that mandate that efficient equipment is coming in and as they make their transition around refrigerants. So there's a deep concern. There's been an ongoing conversation at the Montreal Protocol around dumping of old equipment and dumping of low energy efficient equipment and parts. And I think that this conversation needs to be elevated further. And as we think through policies and minimum energy performance standards, and how do we implement in a way that there's enforcement at borders, so that countries that with limited energy manufacturing capability and electricity capacity and stability have the lowest footprint possible as they struggle with balancing the need for more cooling. So just some kind of opening thoughts there, as well as just to think, for me as working for a company, we've been thinking through internally, how do we support these efforts? We certainly support policies, like I said, minimum energy performance standards, MEPS, and other policies that would limit those issues. I think the other challenge that we see in this transition that's taking shape right now is around refrigerant needs for technology-taking countries. I think this is especially important for them to think through how they prioritize those needs. If they delay their refrigerant transition and address other markets first, this supply side phase down is going to be quite challenging for them in the long run, because equipment lasts. Alan, I think, was talking about this earlier. Equipment is installed and it lasts for 10, 20, 30, even 50 years, and needs those old refrigerants. If it's installed using those old refrigerants, it's going to need that for a very long time. And that, you know, that flies in the face of the goal to reduce these greenhouse gases. So I think thinking through strategies and working with countries to think through strategies and is going to be very important, as well as kind of enabling readiness for these countries. I don't know if you all know this, but there's a lot of turnover in technicians in the U.S. as well as all around the world, and especially in emerging economies. And so getting and keeping people trained, bringing in, you know, some gender equity into this conversation, you know, making those jobs available to all. That's all also an important piece of this puzzle. And so there's a fast-paced motion forward in this immediate transition. You know, Alan is going to talk more, as well as others later on, about the need for the next generation of technologies in this space. I know that we are certainly investing heavily in innovation, and always have as a company, and continue to look at this from the cooling and heating perspective of what's going to be needed long term to meet our net zero goal for 2050, as well as our 2030 goals and our gigaton challenge. So our goal to reduce a gigaton of CO2 emissions for our customers by 2030. So there's the duck feet are moving fast under the water inside our company and all around the world, honestly, to try to move forward these newer technologies for heating, cooling, as well as making sure that people are ready to accept them when it's time. And a lot of work is happening for governments and for non-governmental interests. Andrew, that's just, you know, kind of a quick overview around some of the things from my perspective. You know, happy to talk about more as we move through the dialogue.
Sure. Thank you so much, Helen, for that background. I was wondering if I could ask a couple of quick follow-up questions just to sort of plant the seed for our discussion and give a little bit more background to the audience. On the transition to climate-friendly refrigerants, where we are now, Alan briefly mentioned that there are these very high global warming potential refrigerants that you also mentioned you can get technology lock-in and path dependence, and what it means to accelerate that transition related to the implementation of Kigali or other technologies. So there's sort of this refrigerants piece, which I'd love if you could speak about for just another minute. And then also in terms of energy efficiency, you mentioned policy. There's, you know, a whole suite of policy measures, including minimum energy performance standards, or MEPs, and building codes and things like that. Kind of how the management of energy efficiency plays into this challenge as well.
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. So I think as we think about this refrigerant transition, so that the Kigali Amendment is an HFC phase down. It's not a phase out. And the reason for that is that HFCs are often blended with other components to create refrigerants. And so this is going to be an interesting balancing act. Each country can decide on its own how to implement this supply side phase down. It is a very fast-paced transition. It is fast-paced in markets such as the U.S. as well as emerging markets around the world. These emerging economies are still making their way through the ozone depletion potential phase outs as they start their freeze next year in the supply of these higher global warming potential refrigerants. So it's a very fast-paced transition, but there's no time to sit and think about this. It's if countries delay their refrigerant transition, this very long servicing tail is going to become very problematic for them long term. And so I think quick action is going to be needed, and there's a lot of work to do to kind of prepare for this. So, and if we think about how do we coordinate this from an energy efficiency perspective, again, because action needs to be taken kind of quickly, I think that there's going to be some need to cross-pollinate or share policies across borders, as well as share technologies and resources across borders. It really needs to be a global effort and coordinated across borders to make sure that people can be allowed to use energy efficiency systems from other parts of the world. As policies are implemented, as you can imagine, energy efficiency is measured in different ways in different regions, in different countries. Everybody has designed their own little system. We've got to find a way for technology-taking countries to be able to kind of adopt those technologies, regardless of how they're measured in different places. So there's a lot of detailed work that has to be done, as well as a lot of engagement with kind of local resources to kind of share and move this forward very quickly. Andrew, I don't know that that was what you were looking for, but
that was super helpful, and I think we'll have an opportunity to kind of drill down into these topics over the course of the session. But thank you for giving that clarity. So I think having established the nature of the challenge, the multifaceted nature of the challenge, on adaptation, on and resilience, access to cooling, as well as the need for emissions reduction, both for climate purposes and for grid stability. We are faced with this question of how do we do this, and what are our solution set. And so I would now love to introduce our second panelist, Selçuk, to talk to us a little bit about the enabling environment, and in particular, the technologies that are starting to emerge in the sustainable food space, and how those can be pushed into the marketplace and to access financing more rapidly, particularly in those emerging markets and developing countries where this need is most acute, but where the barriers are often the greatest. So a few words of introduction for Selçuk. Leading the advisory services of IFC's Disruptive Technologies and Funds Department, that's the International Finance Corporation, Selçuk Tanatar works to design innovative solutions leveraging state-of-the-art technologies to address complex challenges in the emerging markets. He is passionate about finding new ways for making technology and financing work in unison to unlock new markets and to create systemic changes that deliver sustainable impact. Selçuk holds a bachelor's in science in production engineering and has more than 25 years of global experience in advising multinational corporations as well as small and medium enterprises in various sectors. With an entrepreneurial spirit, he has also started and spun out companies for developing ICT, IoT, and sensor technologies. Since 2019, Selçuk has been leading IFC's TechEmerge Sustainable Cooling Innovation Program. So Selçuk, please tell us more about TechEmerge and your work at the IFC more broadly in helping to commercialize these critical technologies.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll just share a few slides just to explain the work that we're doing. And with Helen's contribution, I think there are a lot of things that we have to talk about also beyond the technology. But just to give you the background of the TechEmerge program very quickly, is that it's a program that we actually started in 2016. And it was based upon a need that we recorded because as IFC, we are focusing on emerging markets and developing countries. And one of the things that we noticed when working in those countries in advisory side and also investment side is the huge gap in adoption of new technologies. And we set up the program, the Tech Emerge program, as a kind of a matchmaking program where we have a wide range of stakeholders that are interested in new technologies and in a specific sector. And then we have a very curated and structured model on where we are trying to match new technologies with adopters. It sounds as a matchmaking program, but it is actually different than a normal matchmaking program, is that we are actually identifying the needs and then we call for technologies. And we have been working in this area for, as I said, in 2016, where we initially started with the health. Later on, we looked into building resilience in the Indian coastal cities. And in 2019, we focused on and looked into the sustainable cooling innovation. So when just maybe going back once, is people ask us, why is IFC looking at cooling and innovation in that aspect? And actually, when we started in 2019 and we worked and we talked to our investment colleagues on the financing sector and also venture capital investors, private equity firms, and we said we should try to do more in cooling, everybody's face turned into a big question mark. They didn't really understand why. Nobody had talked about why, because cooling is a kind of it's not the core business for many of the businesses that we are working with. And they didn't really understand the impact of what cooling has into their business and their success. So when Alan was mentioning a lot of sectors and etc., I've actually now challenging a lot of people and saying, name me one sector that is not using cooling. And we can find even for steel manufacturing, you're using cooling. Like in cement, you're using cooling. Cooling is everywhere, but nobody really understands the wide impact and wide usage of cooling in different aspects. So when we initially started with doing in the cooling sector, we did a mapping of different technologies and looked into what kind of innovation there is. And then based upon that innovation, we also tried to gauge the interest of adopters in terms of, and the funny thing was, or the interesting thing was, that when we talked to users of cooling, like retail, the housing market, and etc., in all different sectors, everybody was interested in the new cooling technologies, because cooling is becoming more and more important, because not only of climate change, but the cost of energy also. And based upon that, we designed 4 or 5 projects. We initially started in Mexico and Colombia, looking into cooling. And this was the first program that we started. And we said, let's try to look into cooling in the city space, because that is where the most of the cooling happens, for space cooling, for retail, for cold chains, and etc. So we launched, and it was also a first experiment for us to look into how is this going to work in terms of the interest from adopters, as we are calling them, users of the cooling, and innovators. And we had actually, we were very positively surprised and very happy to see that we mobilized about 55, 60 companies across Mexico and Colombia who were interested, and we received applications of more than, I think, 150 different technology companies that applied. And after the matching and looking into how do we test the technology, we started 22 pilots with 18 companies and adopters, and for testing 14 technologies, different in retail, in pharmaceuticals, in agriculture, in education, logistics, and space cooling. So this was a very mixed program. Then we went east, and we looked into Africa, and cold chains in Africa has been one of my big passions across my 15 years in IFC. We have, as IFC and the World Bank and other development into financial institutions, try to make the cold chains work in Africa for many decades now, and have not been very successful. And so we looked into and said, let's try to now infuse and use new technologies in order to see whether we can make it work, and how can we make it work. And there, as Helen was saying, we covered a lot of technologies, starting from the farm gate to all the way to the retail. And we had 21 pilots with 15 companies and 18 different technologies across the transport, the storage, the control and monitoring of the cold chain of products, and pharmaceuticals also there. Moving further east, then we looked into India, because India is regarded as one of the countries that is going to increase their energy consumption for cooling, and where cooling is going to increase for space cooling and for industrial purpose also. But we narrowed down on two specific sectors. One was the hospitality, where we talked to with the hospitality sector and hotels, and they say that some 50 to 60% of their OPEX is actually focused on cooling, or they are spending their money on cooling. There we implemented so far 12 pilots with 2 hospitality chains. One is the IHCL, or Taj Hotels, as they're more known for. And then there is another chain called Chalet Hotels. But we also looked into the retail cold chain, again in India and in Bangladesh, where we are trying to help work with retail companies that are, in order to improve their cold chain across their, I would say, their supply chain. And we try to narrow down on specific areas in, for example, in storage before that they get it to retail. And there we have 8 pilots with 3 different retailers and 5 different technologies. One aspect that we also looked at, maybe very briefly, was in trying to see in what is there into the free energy that is in the liquefied natural gas. Many people may not know that when you transform gas to liquefied natural gas, you're actually using 10% of the gas to cool it down, so it becomes liquid. And that energy is then released when you are then gasified for distribution in the receiving market. And there we did a study in India in order to see how much of that energy we could capture in order to use it for productive use in the cooling sector. But having all these, our track record so far is that so far we have been working with about 30 plus technology companies, with 40 companies across the world on the adopting and testing of these new technologies. And we have about 45 plus different technologies at different stages in their technology readiness level, and 60 plus. I think we are now at 70 pilot and field tests of these technologies, and we have spent about 8 million, as we said, with a very generous contribution of UK government in order to implement this program. Some very key numbers, just to provide a very brief overview, is that the technologies that we have seen that it is easily achievable to achieve anything between 15-20%, all the way up to 80% energy efficiency by using some of these technologies. And when we calculate about the greenhouse gas emissions that can be saved, it's that we are estimating it to 2+ million if these technologies should be scaled up. And the good thing is also that we have seen with our initiative is that we have seen a lot of cooperation starting between the adopters, as we are calling them, and the innovating companies, that some of them are now investing in these technologies in order to adopt them at a wider scale within their companies. But we have also seen a lot of collaboration between the innovators in terms of cooperation and delivering whole systems or improving the technology further. And all of these technologies are then progressing in the technology readiness level. And we are also seeing that there is more and more financing that is actually now going into these companies. When we last took stock, this was before, for about 7-8 months ago, it was 35+ million that went in. But with recent announcements I think during the last 3 or 4 months, this number has now grown to almost 70 million. And one key success that we achieved within IFC was to get our investment colleagues interested in cooling. And we did our first investment in a district cooling platform together with Tabreed in IFC, $100 million platform for Asia, of which IFC put in 25 million equity. And we are still continuing to pursue these opportunities for more financing. But in spite of all this, we still have a lot of challenges. And it's like very related to what Alan was mentioning, what Helen was mentioning, is one of the things that we have seen is the energy access. One thing specifically in the rural areas and in the poor markets, the technologies we have brought to market actually deliver what they promise. They do provide much more efficient cooling than any traditional equipment that we have in the markets now, but they still need energy. And many of the technologies, they have a big barrier in scaling up in these, specifically at the farm gate and in the poor rural communities in Africa, because they don't have access to energy. So energy is a must. Although they require less energy, it is still a must to have that reliable energy. Another thing that we have seen has been very challenging is the integration part, because the technologies that we have tested is focusing on a specific aspect of the cooling system, as we are calling it. And then the adoption of it, specifically when we work with industrial companies and larger companies, that needs to be integrated into the rest of the system, whether it be for, like in the hotels, or whether it be in food producing production facilities and so on. And that has become a very big challenge for integrating. And then we have also seen that adoption, one of the things that the reason for that large scale mission critical operations like data centers and hotels, they are lagging very much behind in adopting new technology, is because they don't want to take any risk. They have to have the operation. So in new technology, that is difficult. And as Helen was mentioning, it's like the technology requires new skills. It requires skills. And the existing, there is a lot of, like already a lack of skills even in the developed countries. In the developing countries, it's even worse. So it requires a big, like investment in skills, but it also a big barrier for scaling the adoption. And the skills gap persists. We try to look into where is the skills gap, and we have seen that the skills gap is across the entire spectrum, engineering, technicians, and even at the user base, because they don't really know how to use the new technology. And lastly, on the financing that we have looked into, is that there is a huge need for financing in this area, for innovation specifically, and also for renewal and upgrading of the existing technologies. So first on the R&D and innovation, we have seen very little innovation going on into new innovation. And it's also, when we did our initial mapping, we have also seen that there is a scarcity of innovation, because obviously innovation in cooling is not a big, money maker for investors. And therefore, when we compared with our previous initiatives for example, in health tech, is that we found tens of thousands of innovators and startups, while in the cooling sector so far, we have not been able to go more than 500-600 globally. And maybe the number is 1,000 to 1,500. That's what we are estimating it to. So besides the innovation, there are some of the innovation that are very promising. So it also needs financing to commercialization to scale them up and get that production and so that it can be adopted at a wider scale. And then what's mostly important, I think, is the scale up and new business model. Because as Helen was mentioning, the secondhand equipment, and also when we went into, for example, those hotels, we see equipment that is 10, 15 years old. And one thing that we are fearing now as TechEmerge is that when we stop our program, is that maybe in 10 or 15 years' time or 20 years' time, if somebody is going to do a new initiative, they will be seeing the equipment we installed today. So it's not going to be upgraded. So the constant upgrade and focusing on innovation is going to be very limited. So that's why we believe that there is going to be need for a new business model, and it's probably going to go through cooling as a service, where you can have professionals that are maintaining a system. It's like having your car, you don't do your own maintenance, but you have your dealer and the service and mechanics who are dealing with that your car is operating properly. So with that, that's a kind of a reflection on what we have been doing so far. And but we are continuing our last phase of the TechEmerge program. And please visit our techemerge.org website and join us in making cooling more sustainable in the future.
Thank you so much, Selçuk. Really incredible work that the IFC is doing, and hats off to the UK government for helping to make that program possible. I wanted to ask one follow-up question. I think it's remarkable how many partnerships you help to facilitate and catalyze. Of course, you also mentioned a lot of challenges that remain as well. How, looking back on this first phase of the program, do you evaluate success, right? How can, these small programs that have been seeded be catalytic and lead to these bigger efforts at scaling and chipping away at these large problems? I'm wondering if you could speak to that quickly. I mean, how do you judge the success of this program in the face of those large challenges?
That's a really good question, and something that we have very difficulty in explaining to both our, like our innovators and adopters, but also to the rest of the world. So the Tech Emerge program, Andrew, we designed it as, when we were looking into it, is like people are looking at big success. Oh, this was bought, or this was scaled up, or somebody invested a lot of millions into one technology. We are looking at it from a different way, because what the Tech Emerge program does is, like, we are saying, when people are asking me in one sentence, what are you doing? And I'm saying we are de-risking the adoption of new technology. So the way that how success looks for us in the Tech Emerge program is that we are helping companies to find suitable technology, adequate technology for their needs, and then we put it into action. So we help them with financial means and technical assistance to test the technology. And because we have, as an engineer, and everybody who's an engineer probably knows that when the rubber hits the road with your technology, not everything works as initially anticipated. But that testing provides a huge know-how and knowledge, both to the innovator, in terms of, for the innovator, they figure out how does it work and do we deliver what we are promising. And the adopter side looks at the technology and they look into and say, can I use it, or can I adapt it, or in order for me to use it and make a, like a good efficiency gain, and also identify the areas that they probably will need to change in their internal processes. And that is where we are defining the successes, that we say, when we finish a pilot, a field testing of a technology, if it has provided sufficient data and evidence whether a technology has worked or not, that's a big success for us. Because in the field testing, normally our success rate in that term is, we are around 85 to 90% of all the pilots that we do, they produce that sufficient evidence. While in a non-curated way and the way that people who do it on their own, about 50%, 60% of the pilots, they fail to even finish testing because of different, I would say, reasons that can go wrong. And that's where the Tech Emerge process becomes such valuable for both our adopters and innovators. And we always get the feedback after finishing our Tech Emerge program that the innovators and adopters, they say, initially the financing was good because you offset some of the financial risk. But the most valuable part was your guidance and your technical assistance during the testing of the technology.
Thanks so much, Selçuk. I think it really highlights the importance of this intervention, right, from governments, from philanthropy, from non-commercial sources to really help to de-risk the technology, as you said, which is critical. And yet there are so many other gaps in terms of business model development, in terms of financing, that piece is also quite essential. And I think definitely something that the Gary audience here is particularly interested in. So I think that tees up nicely our last speaker, our last panelist, Jonathan Naiman. And I'll introduce him and then give him the floor to talk a little bit about the finance piece. Jonathan is the managing partner at Sistana Cooling Partners, an impact investment venture. SCP for short is dedicated to investing into private companies that can improve cooling access and reduce the energy footprint for each ton of refrigeration. Mr. Naiman is a sustainable finance pioneer who helped to pioneer novel green debt instruments, best-in-class public equity, and structured renewable finance products that have facilitated introduction of more than $1 trillion of private capital from institutional investors into debt, equity, and decentralized renewable infrastructure. Previously, Jonathan held positions with Light Green Advisors, the Investor Responsibility Research Center, ABB, ICF, and the U.S. House Energy and Commerce Committee. He has degrees in environmental management and molecular biology from UNC and MIT. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. Very excited to hear more about Sistana and your views on the finance opportunity in the sustainable cooling space.
Sure. Thank you very much, Andrew. Would you mind sharing the slides that I sent you earlier today?
Sure. One moment, and I will pull those up.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the work that you and Alan are doing to bring attention to this space. I feel like people are more aware of the importance of the heat challenge now, but less systematic thinking has gone into the solution set. And in some ways, you know, this reminds me of where renewables were in the late 90s. And if you go to the first slide, please. So the first point I wanted to make is that while energy and greenhouse gas emissions have got most of the attention, cooling is really vital for a lot of other goals that are encapsulated in the SDGs, especially ending hunger, providing healthcare and education. Essentially, it's not just vaccines, it's the entire hospital doesn't work without a cold chain. If you go to the next slide. The cooling requires more than twice as much energy as is produced by solar and wind globally. There's over $1 trillion that is invested into the top 10 verticals for the energy transition, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And cooling doesn't even show up on this. And that's because essentially there are no independent cooling funds. And in some ways, this is reminiscent of what renewables looked like in the late 90s. There was investment in renewables, but it came from strategic corporates that were in the sector already. And there was individual project finance. I've been involved in some project finance activities, as well as food, IT, and real estate related cooling. But what is missing from this picture is dedicated investment funds devoted to energy efficient cooling. And if you go to the next slide. Now, what are the barriers? You know, why, if cooling is so important, is there so little investment on the part, you know, of obviously companies like Trane are providing and the backstop for the world, but what is, you know, why is there less investment than you would expect for something that can be decisive in terms of how grids operate, how you know, what the actual greenhouse gas emissions that occur from different industries are. And Alan talked about the challenge of cooling being integral to other types of businesses, such as buildings. I would focus on the high returns that venture investors have been able to get from software over the last 30, 40 years that have really stymied the interest on the part of particularly US and Anglo-Saxon investors. So essentially, with the sole exception of cooling chips, there are very few large transactions, venture transactions involved with cooling. There's a lot of capital that's required, and the bulk of the opportunity is really in developing markets that are risky, and as a result, there's a requirement that this area be de-risked from a financial perspective, in some ways in parallel to the type of work that Selçuk has been describing in terms of de-risking new technology introduction. If you go to the next slide. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about what type of instruments are available to quote unquote scale up or capitalize cooling innovation. And essentially there's a bit of a mismatch between where the global community has been historically putting in funds and what our aspirations are in terms of accelerating cooling innovation. So to start with, commercial debt is simply not available for startups in developing countries. Development finance, there's obviously small grants programs, and companies like To Breathe that are billion-dollar companies are eligible to attract debt from organizations like the IFC. But private equity and traditional development finance are not really well suited to cooling startups that don't have stable cash flow. Venture capital supporting private companies is really the most effective mechanism that has been found on Earth so far for accelerating the growth of companies and getting them to the stage where they can be incorporated into the global supply chain and into companies like Train that are the logical exits for many of these innovators. The problem is, venture capital is very much a return-driven exercise, and the returns from cooling are not quite high enough to compete with returns from other sectors that have more creditworthy counterparties and that there's a much lower perceived risk for software-enabled products. And that's one of the reasons we see, literally hundreds of startups claiming energy benefits from, more AI-based control systems, is those are really cheap to develop in comparison with hardware-related products that are more likely to actually have a large climate impact. And so what's missing is what's on the top of our pyramid, which is impact venture. And that's the notion of venture capital that is actually designed to create impact, supported by investors that want to create impact and are electing to use equity instruments rather than debt instruments. It's axiomatic that debt is inherently conservative. It's been that way for something like 1,000 years. If you go to the next slide. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is, over the last 10 years, I've identified a tremendous amount of cooling innovators in diverse sectors, and through our partnerships with other organizations in the field, we've identified a lot of different cooling innovation types, ranging from phase change materials, which are a staple in many university research programs, to solar cooling, to liquid desiccants, to innovative heat transfer fluids, to magnetic cooling. So there's actually a lot of innovation, but relatively low amounts of venture capital in the space. So in some ways, it's attractive to me as an investor because the valuations are pretty compelling, because you don't have much competition in you can get exposure to all of these different approaches to cooling. If you go to the next slide. So I'll just talk briefly about one of the companies, and I think Selçuk is also familiar with this company, but it's an Asian green building and engineering company that has a primary business of doing engineering to reduce chiller energy consumption and in green buildings in Southern Asia. They've developed a graphene-based heat transfer additive that has been demonstrated to reduce electric use in the compressors that are used in chillers in high humidity Southeast Asia conditions where, we're talking about 90% humidity and 30 degrees Celsius. So there's a tremendous potential, certainly more than 1 gigaton from utilizing this. There's a trend globally towards using water-based chillers since the heat capacity of water is so much higher than that of air. The company actually needs to produce a physical product using chemicals. And so that's not the type of thing that, most venture capitalists want to invest in. And so it's had a challenge with trying to get the resources it needs to pivot from doing demonstrations supported by a government innovation and science and technology program, very similar in some ways to the UK program, but to pivot from that to commercial production, to hiring the type of sales and operations teams that are required to service the rapidly growing cooling markets in Southeast Asia, where virtually every building is air conditioned, and it's the #1 use of electricity in these markets. If you go to the next slide. So, and you can go to the next slide. So we've built a team composed of leaders, including Alan, who've looked at cooling for many years. And that's it. We can go to the last slide. And I guess I would just close with saying we shouldn't be unrealistic about expecting debt instruments or small grant programs to do the work that venture capital is best at doing. And innovative cooling companies simply lack the dedicated capital that's required and that does support preferred sectors like EVs and renewables. And emerging markets don't really have the venture capital depth to support cooling innovators themselves. So there's really a very interesting opportunity for the development finance community to come together with philanthropists that are interested in supporting SDGs and helping people and communities adapt to warmer temperatures and climate change. And this is really a tremendous impact investing opportunity. And I'm looking forward to meeting people who may be on this call to talk about ways that we can work together to build a new type of facility that will make the right type of equity investments into these companies, because it's really companies that are developing these technologies, rather than government labs. And there has been really good support of government labs and research organizations throughout the OECD countries, and even in some of these developing countries. But it seems like what's missing in the capital markets is really this venture impact capital. And so if you go to the next slide, that's really it. So we think this is a great opportunity, and we're fortunate that the COP will have a cooling day. And while we have nothing to announce now, we're optimistic that we will have a set of partners to announce something at the COP. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, for laying out the investment case. and the need for impact venture as a type of capital that's really critical for commercializing these early stage technologies in emerging markets. I wanted to ask a quick follow-up. Could you elaborate a little bit on the Sistana Fund strategy for investing in these early stage technologies at the venture level and focusing on these markets? Is that something that has been established at this point, or
Yeah. So in some ways, it's very conventional. A $200 million fund will make a group of investments. It'll be in the area of let's call it, 3 to 5 million per company. We'll keep some dry powder for follow-up rounds. What I think the unconventional part is that we're interested in working with eleemosynary organizations, including some philanthropies as well as development finance organizations, to build a reserve fund that can buffer some of the risk that comes with emerging markets. It's not a secret that contract abrogation is an issue, and when you go to cooling as a service, it's very easy to talk about in Switzerland, but a lot of the largest users of cooling are government offices, and a lot of governments have political changes and don't honor contracts. So we think that this type of structured finance facility, which will have some level of soft donor capital, potentially from governments that are interested in accelerating cooling adaptation in the emerging markets, will help mitigate the risks. They won't, obviously we'll still have the risks, but will help us attract private capital that may be interested in uncorrelated returns. So, but we're very much, viewing this as something which will not be a traditional venture capital play. It will have a reserve core, which comes from organizations that are interested in supporting global adaptation and resilience, and cooling is essentially vital to it. And the one thing I would add to what's been said already is that technology is really essential. This is not the type of thing where you get any benefit in terms of reducing the stunting of people and the health costs that come from extreme heat without providing the service. So naming the heat wave is great, but if you're in India and the local health center doesn't have a working air conditioning system, the x-rays are not accurate. And stunting occurs. So anyway,
thank you so much for that, Jonathan.
Sure.
Really, really helpful and compelling. So colleagues, we're now going to shift with our last 12 to 15 minutes to our discussion and to our Q&A. So I wanted to invite audience members to drop questions to the chat. And I also have a few questions teed up for our panelists that we can launch into now as well. So for starters, I'd like to come back to you, Helen, to ask you about your experience on the Montreal Protocol Technical and Economic Assessment Panel, or TEAP, which I think has really, I would imagine, given you a good perch to really see what some of these opportunities are in the technology space, but also some of the challenges. And if you could tell us from your experience there, what you see as some of the opportunities that are coming online related to the high global warming potential for phase down and addressing these cooling demands.
Thank you, Andrew. I think kind of sitting on the Technical and Economic Assessment Panel the TEAP has allowed me to especially because I do a lot of the modeling for them. So kind of looking at the pace of change as well as the kind of the potential possible outcomes. So kind of how things look if no changes are made, and how different strategies from a policy perspective can impact kind of success rates as well as the difficulty with which a transition takes place. And that's my reason for my message of urgency, because I've looked especially at these parties, these countries that that do not manufacture within their borders. And for them, I think that we call kind of a servicing tail, so that long-term continued use of high global warming potential refrigerants becomes really problematic for their ability to continue to stay within that supply side phase down. So it's certainly, and also I've kind of had a bird's eye view watching the parties, think through how to incorporate this energy efficiency requirement from the protocol, which I think is very, it's certainly very interesting to watch their thought process as they consider how to incorporate that. So, I think there's some very, very basic table stakes things to be done around minimum energy performance standards, MEPs for many countries, as well as as well as some other things around training and so on. So it's an exciting time. It's going to be a very busy time around the world, and including this energy efficiency piece. It not only has immediate benefits, but it also reduces demand on the grid as there's larger uptake of cooling and heating equipment. So it has just so many benefits to it. And so very excited to kind of see this take shape.
Thank you so much, Helen. I wanted to get to one of the questions from the chat that we have. And Selchuk, I think this one is a good one for you. Have there been any innovations or technologies, perhaps we can take this from the tech emerge technologies you've supported, that you've seen that help to get around the need of traditional energy access? And I know this directly addresses something you spoke to, right? That even the best cooling solution, if it requires electricity, it is dependent on the access to electricity and reliability of that electricity. Are any of the pilot projects that you have supported seeking to address those challenges around access?
I'm happy to say yes. And I think one of the things that I was actually going to outline, and I do in meetings, is I think we have to have a paradigm shift when we are thinking about cooling, that cooling is not equal to electricity. Cooling is a matter about energy and how you transform energy and how you carry energy. And in that context, we have, for example, I have 1, 2, maybe 3 technologies that we have tested. One is based on solar thermal. It's a Danish company called Purix, and they have developed a solar thermal air conditioner, and has initially designed it for as a room air conditioning system, but we have tested it in both in commercial scale and are now also testing it for initial farm gate cooling. And that's a system that can run completely off grid. It still requires some electricity, but it requires 80–85% less electricity than traditional air conditioners and chillers. So therefore, the electricity part can be, supplied by a small-scale solar PV. Another technology is, like biomass-based and heat-based. Where you have heat-based system, you can use different type of chillers. We have a UK company from UK that has I would say chiller that can run on. It was initially designed to tap into diesel gensets heat waste and the exhaust waste, but they are now testing it with LPG, and they're also going to test it with biomass so that you can power this system. But beyond that, there are some very interesting other technologies. For example, you're working with an American company called Heat Inverse that is, like that has developed a film so that you can reject heat. And that would also help so I think that's why that we have to think thermally in terms of new cooling systems. And one of the things that I've also underlined as the last thing is I think in order to make a really groundbreaking progress in cooling and cooling efficiency, I think one of the areas that we have seen are missing is research and deployment of new materials and material science. And we are seeing a lot of, and this morning I actually heard there is, for example, a company in MIT that has developed a cooling system which is using metal organic frameworks for improving the absorption of and humidity that can save. So material science is something that we need, and that's why that we are underlining we have to get more money and more funding into research and development and increase the number of innovations and looking into it in a different way than just electricity supply.
Andrew, could I also chime in a little bit on this for very quickly?
Please.
Some of the one of the most fun things that I have seen in my new company at Train Technologies, we're working on projects under our Operation Possible umbrella. So we just commercialized. We licensed some new technology for solar operated cooling carts for food vendors in India. So 300 new carts on the street so that that are run by solar power, and they were manufactured locally. We're trying to work with other entities around the world to operationalize these in other places. But this is our resources as engineers kind of volunteering to kind of design, what is the biggest need of the day and how do we get at it, right? Because like you said, not everybody has access to energy, and this is a way to kind of work around that as well as preserve food and help with local economies. Another very nerdy technology that I would mention that I think is so exciting is the use of thermal energy storage. So I don't know if you've heard of thermal energy storage, but one of the things the ways that's designed is to make big ice cubes. So if you think about the challenge of heating in very, very cold temperatures, ice, melts at 0 C. And so if you make ice, you can make it at any cold temperature. And then you're kind of lifting the temperature up from 0 up to whatever is needed to kind of keep grandma warm, instead of going from -20 or 30 degrees, which can be very, very difficult in a heavy lift. So just a couple of different technologies. There's a lot happening in this space. With small companies and with big companies, trying to get at this in a way that maybe can use a more renewable energy and kind of shift the demand to other parts of the day. There's a lot of work being done to reduce loads in building design, and I think that it's important to kind of keep those in our lens as well.
I also would like to emphasize what Selchuk was saying about using non-electric sources. But solar thermal cooling is actually, almost 100 years old. The largest, there's a pretty large high school in Scottsdale that a colleague of mine worked on. It's the largest solar cooling project in the United States. So it's commercial today. It's not something which is impossible, but the business models for doing it outside of the wealthiest communities need to be developed, and that requires the type of capital that the firms that engineered that simply don't have. And so to me, this reminds me of where solar was in calendar year 2000. So when I say solar, I'm talking about solar PV, which is actually more recent. A lot of the technical solutions really are there, but there's the absence of that type of risk capital that can bring it up to this, out of the small cart stage to the stage that it's actually, relevant. But we also have a company in our inventory that we'd like to be able to support that, but does biomass-based cooling, and Selchuk may be familiar with it, but in many parts of the world, electric cooling doesn't make sense because you're surrounded by fields and there's no electric service. And so the idea of using thermal energy to drive chillers is pretty intelligent, and there's relatively little funding for that.
Thank you so much, Helen and John, speaking to those technical solutions that are out there, and refocusing us on this need for capital, right? The risk capital, the patient capital, impact capital that really can help to push these technologies into the marketplace, and particularly in the emerging markets where it's most needed. So with that, we're out of time. I wanted to thank all of our panelists, and as well as Alan, our keynote, for a terrific discussion and for really, really enriching remarks. And let me turn it back to Lori to close us out.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. This was a fantastic discussion. I've got lots of notes, and we will summarize this and post a brief summary along with the recording on the Gary website. We will also send it out, the recording and the summary, to everyone who registered, not just the participants today, but a lot of times people register and can't make it. So we will send it to everyone who registered today. And again, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, Andrew, for doing a great job moderating and pulling this together. And we just really appreciate the opportunity for you all to help us pursue our mission, which is catalyzing private sector investment in resilience. That's what Gary is about. And this is very much the type of innovation and discussions that we are hoping to further and broaden our audience. So again, really appreciate each of you. And you can find the summary and recording on the website. Thanks again, and we will see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.